Well, thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. Can you hear me? This working? Okay. Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I'm so excited to be back in Philadelphia. I actually lived here almost 20 years ago, and I'm also really excited to see Sean, my good friend, and to meet so many people here. It's really a pleasure. And I was telling Catherine that I don't typically speak with landscape architecture audiences, so I'm actually a little bit nervous too because I'm not sure if you. I typically speak with architects, but here we go. So, oh, let's go. Okay, so yeah, so the title of my talk is "In Consideration of Neighbors," and maybe just to reflect on that a little bit. One question that I think about a lot, and I ask in my work and with others is, who do we really think of our neighbors, and are they only other humans? As architects, and as I said, I'm trained as an architect. I did my undergrad in architecture. My grad's is in architecture, and so I think as architects, we often kind of think about the idea of clients. Like we understand our relationship with clients. We understand, outside of our clients, there are users. But outside of that, who else impacts the work that we, or is impacted by the work that we do? And that's a question that I always ask my students. I've been um, I've been really interested in the conflicted perception that we as humans have toward animals, and so when we see the artifacts that we design for animals, I think we can see this conflict, right? So on the one hand, we like seeing birds in our backyards and in parks, and exemplified by this kind of cute birdhouse. But then on the other hand, we also don't want birds to touch our buildings, so we see things like bird prevention spikes. And I've also been really interested in this idea of the perception of maintenance and care. So this is scenes from Buffalo. Um, there's a lot of sites in Buffalo where there's under-maintained structures and kind of crumbling walls. And this is a biologist who I had collaborated with at one point, and she's kind of pointing out how this is great habitat. But in sites like this, oftentimes, even though this might be kind of great biodiverse habitat, these are perceived as situations of urban blight because they're perceived as places without care. And I think this kind of perception of like how places are cared for and the relationship between under maintenance and a certain kind of perception, I think that there is a kind of issue there for me in terms of in terms of just the biodiversity crisis that we're facing, right? So like given this situation, how do we address this conflict? And so many years ago, when I first started uh, thinking about these issues, when I first moved to Buffalo, actually, um, I started to kind of, in the early days, basically walking around the city when I first moved there and sort of daydreaming and thinking about ways to reconsider building typologies and adaptive reuse in some of my speculative projects. So I was developing models and collages like these. And simultaneously, I started to kind of think about how we could build structures to invite animals to live in. And specifically at that time, I was thinking about bat habitation. So my earliest project is called Bat Tower. This is, or the earliest kind of built-in intervention is called Bat Tower. And this is a project that, let's see what's on the screen. Yeah, so this is a project that is basically a very conspicuous looking tower that takes some of its cues, design cues, from the fact that bats like to live in thin, spaces. Many of you probably, since you're landscape architects, you probably know this, but bats can get into like very, very small cracks, like half an inch thick. They can get into your attic, and because they prefer like really warm kind of consistent temperatures. Something like a little, just a crack in your attic will invite bats to go in. So and there's many instances such as like the Bat Bridge or the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, where bats are literally living in the kind of expansion joints of the bridge because they just live in these like little cracks. And so taking cues from that, the project basically worked with a spatial idea of layering wood pieces that would also create all these like layered thin spaces. So this is the kind of facade, not the facade, but the kind of exterior of the tower for bats to enter, and this is the interior, which was meant to kind of resemble a kind of cave or an interior, a bit of a kind of vertical cave. Of course, thinking not just about the bats as a singular species. Obviously, you always have to think about the ecosystem, as you all know, as landscape architects, and so we also kind of created a planter at the base where we could plant plants that would hopefully attract insects to attract the bats as well. This is also sited near a pond. Um, here's some photos of the team building the project, and a fun thing that happened is because of the kind of scrappy nature of this and the low budget, I ended up having to like learn how to operate a rough terrain forklift as part of a kind of cost-cutting measure for the project. So that's me driving that thing, and here's the project when it was completed. Kind of along similar lines, another project I developed is called Habitat Wall. So you can again see the kind of layered boards and spaces there. The idea of this project is, again, if you kind of see the layered spaces, and this is sort of one bay of that's inserted within that kind of series of structural bays along what was going to be a kind of shed wall. There's also bird boxes up at top. Another idea that I was working with this project was also thinking about the kind of green demolition economy in Buffalo, because there's and still right now, but more so when I first moved to Buffalo, there was a lot of building demolition going on, and there were all these kind of organizations that were not just demolishing buildings and throwing in landfill, but like taking buildings apart piece by piece and salvaging materials for people to use to repurpose and use. So I was looking at repurposing pieces of window, as you can see, are the shutters, and salvage wood and so on. I was invited, as I was kind of building this project as a prototype, I was invited to exhibit it in a gallery, inside a gallery. Unfortunately, I kind of wanted to be outside, but they insisted I was inside. But anyway, here's some images of the opening at SAIC, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I found it really interesting that that here, speaking of what is it like to be like a bat, here's one of the guests sort of laying on the ground, like looking up into the space as if she were a bat, trying to get a sense of what it might look like. And you can see in the photo on the left what the view would be like for a bat. So another kind of early project is called Bat Cloud. The idea of this is again a small intervention, kind of in this case it's installed in a nature preserve in Buffalo. And the idea of this is that it would be kind of like an artifice floating in a place where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. It's meant to kind of be perceived as a cloud. Closer up, you can see that it's a number of pods hanging. Here's some drawings showing what each of these pods is like. So again, you can see in that red cutaway part the kind of cavities for bats to live in, and some views from the top. Here's a plan showing how it was hung between trees. More building photos. And I think one of the things that was quite interesting about this project is, even though it was, just in the history of projects I've done, really the lowest budget project, I think it had, because of its presence in this area, Tiff Nature Preserve, which was a former landfill and a very popular place for people in Buffalo, I immediately got a lot of reactions from the public at that time. Like, there were people who were asking me things like, could I sell them one of these pods, or could I get bats out of their house? Somehow I suddenly was a bat expert because I made these. Or could I help their kid who was a Boy Scout, make bat houses for their Boy Scout or Eagle Scout project? And so around that time, because I was starting to get this kind of flood of questions about like getting bats out of their house and stuff, I started to think about, what the impact of these small-scale projects could be, especially in kind of reversing the sort of typically negative impression that we have of bats as kind of rabid vampires, and how can we shift the perception of bats, especially in the face of a crisis like white nose syndrome, which, as many of you might know, is a fungal disease that's been wiping off bats or killing bats in many caves. And so really the kind of need to kind of conserve bats is quite important, but this is not something that has been typically in the public radar, I think. And so thinking about the kind of, the impact of small-scale projects, I started to think like, well, could we start to, imagine what would happen if these kind of were aggregated across the landscape? Like, what could this be like? And so along those lines, I also started a research project called generative zoning at the time, where I was really looking at what the possibilities could be and this is again a speculative project doing research on zoning in Buffalo at the time, thinking about, again, sort of researching and I'm not going to go into the details of exactly what I was finding here, but one of the things I found is, if you can see all the areas colored in green, are programs are basically programs that are required to have a 100-foot setback if it's in an industrial area that is adjacent to a residential area. So if you look at the zoning, this is the former Buffalo zoning code. If there's an industrial property next to a residential property, that industrial property needs to have a 100-foot setback. And so I started to look at you know, look again back at Buffalo, and there's, you know, if you kind of highlight where those boundaries are, you basically see situations. Here's another example. You see situations like this, where there's residential on one side, and then the boundary, and then on the other side, a gigantic, you know, 100-foot setback. 100 feet is like half of a block in Manhattan, so it's like a huge setback that's required. And so what happens in these situations? Oftentimes they're left, you know, there's just garbage, you know, people see it as a restriction on development. So I started to ask, like, well, what if you started to look at these boundary conditions and start to kind of, you know, and start to kind of connect them through, you know, existing green spaces, through vacant properties. What could a new kind of or green infrastructure look like that took advantage of these, you know, setbacks in the city? Is that a, I mean, anyway, so I don't know what that sound was. Yeah, so anyway, so here's, so, you know, so here are some speculative mappings of like what some of these kind of new, you know, what could be produced by kind of mining our zoning conditions at that time. And simultaneously, I also started to think about, you know, the role of architecture as a form of generative activism. So, you know, and there's already a lot of architects looking at conditions like bird glass collision. There's, most of you probably know birds can't see clear glass, so that's one of the kind of major killers of birds in urban areas. They fly into glass and they die. And so there's a number of, you know, studies and resources already, like from American Bird Conservancy for bird safe building guidelines and so on. There's different types of glass that architects are looking at to make, you know, bird safe glass. But I was really interested in how we could think about this as a kind of design prompt. Like, how can you really sort of amplify the kind of the issue of needing bird safe glass through design? So this is a kind of renovation of an existing window in a gallery, again in Chicago. It's at SAIC, basically called No Crash Zone. It basically takes the idea of, you know, a visual interference pattern and putting it on the glass in a way where you're also kind of suggesting this idea of this need for humans to kind of have a sort of directed frame view outside. So, and around, and kind of given the you know, the kind of activism interest of the time as well, I started to kind of talk with groups like Cities Living Laboratory, which is a arts organization based in New York City that is run by the land artist Mary Miss, who I'm sure you all know. And she was, she had invited me to basically to work with scientists and artists on developing a number of walks around New York City where to basically kind of give workshops on bird safe glass and bird strike prevention and stuff. So these are activities, for example, where we're pointing out certain skyscrapers and having participants like draw possible, you know, visual interference patterns on the skyscrapers, like, you know, while they were, you know, walking around and so on. So and through this kind of connection with Mary Miss and Cities Living Lab, I was commissioned in 2016 to develop an installation for environmental advocacy in collaboration with a visual artist named Ellen Driscoll, who at the time was creating a number of paintings that were depicting local birds in Buffalo. And she's from New York City, but she was working with me at the time. And she was painting a number of birds and local vegetation in Buffalo in these kind of these paintings here. And we basically were looking at ways to kind of frame these kind of custom-made glass pieces in these kind of building fragments. So the idea of this project, which we call Bower, is that it's a number of kind of almost building-like fragments that reference, you know, residential vernacular structures scattered across the landscape. Each one of them has a series of bird nesting boxes at the top, designed for 7 different local species, and then the kind of the parts where the lower parts where you see the windows are all framed, are all, you know, the kind of paintings, the kind of custom-made glass pieces with with Ellen's paintings in them, also with this kind of dot pattern on them, which is a kind of amplification of the visual interference pattern that's needed to keep birds away. It's like kind of a 2-inch by 4-inch rectangle that you kind of need to have on glass for birds to really see it properly. And in addition to you know, working on environmental advocacy projects, I also started around the same time to kind of think about ways of working more kind of intensely in interdisciplinary collaborations with scientists. And early on, I had collaborated with Katarina Dittmar, who was a biologist in Buffalo, and she started to kind of talk with me about, how can architecture start to kind of become almost like vehicles for science experiments and or kind of explorations in some way. And I think maybe the project that best exemplifies this type of collaboration is with interdisciplinary partners. There's this one that I did in Australia called Life Support. This is essentially a project that reuses an existing tree to create a vertical habitat structure. And how this came about is that I, through a kind of academic conference, I actually met these two people, Darren LaRue, who's an ecologist in Canberra, Australia. He's works for the Australian Capital Territories Parks and Conservation Department, and Mitchell Whitelaw, the fellow in black, who is a data visualization designer at the Australian National University. And at the conference, we sort of quickly discovered our kind of mutual interests, and they invited me to collaborate on thinking about a project in Australia. And so at the time when I went to Australia, coincidentally, there was a tree in a residential neighborhood that was being slated to be removed. This is apparently something that happens quite often there, because there are these very, very large trees in residential neighborhoods where people have built so close to the tree that the branches, when they fall, are like kind of, destroying the roofs of people's houses and cars and stuff like that. So there's actually a lot of trees on this kind of takedown list, right? And so typically when a tree is taken down, it's just, cut into firewood or made into mulch and stuff. But in this case, because Darren's research was also looking at the kind of ecological value of very large old trees and their role in enhancing biodiversity, he was very adamant about finding a way to take down the tree in as few pieces as possible, to reuse the tree in as few pieces as possible. So here's the tree being moved to a site in a place called Bear Hill. This is an ecological offset zone, right adjacent to an area that's being urbanized. And as you can see, it's been totally, this is a deforested piece of land that they are working to kind of, to replant. You can see all these kind of trees that have been planted there. But of course, because it takes a very long time for trees to grow, you know this better than I do, in order to really kind of try to introduce or reintroduce habitat back into this area, they really were looking for artificial habitat structures to be built here. And so that was where I kind of came into the picture. By basically taking a tree and repurposing it, this was the idea. And it was a fun process for me too, because I'd never actually worked with a tree before in this way. So there was a process of using photogrammetry to try to actually get a model of the tree. I'd never modeled a tree in Rhino before, but this was a way to do it. And we were able to actually get it kind of like accurate enough. We were able to get to work with structural engineers to actually get this up safely and to get it permitted and all these things. So here's the tree being I keep calling it the tree, but it's actually not a tree anymore. Now this is tree parts being reconstructed into a habitat structure. And here's some of its here's it on opening day. A lot of these offcuts that are hanging off it are also bat houses and bird houses that were kind of carved away with a chainsaw. One of the things that was really interesting is that we actually attached camera traps to the top of the tree, so to the project. And the camera traps are basically motion sensing cameras, and they captured just from the first I think 4 months or 5 months in 2019 after it was built, it captured over 1,500 observations of birds with species richness that was much higher. There were 24 bird species that were observed just from the camera traps. And so that was significantly higher than any other kind of structure that was kind of erected in that area. And so we were very excited about even just the idea that we had collaborated together, not only between disciplines but also across continents. So we actually even wrote a paper about the collaboration. So here's a timeline that I created for that. And I think and I don't know if you have this in landscape architecture, but in architecture and professional practice, we always see this diagram. It's called the architect, contractor, client triangle. And I was really interested in how we can rethink the kind of seemingly clean logics in this kind of triangle. Like, how do we, and rather than kind of thinking about architecture done in this way, how can we rethink the relationships that in collaborations to better describe the nature of co-authorship, and also thinking about not just in a system of exchanges, but also thinking more about kind of shared territories of interest and knowledge. So that's what this diagram was trying to explain. very recently, in just last year, I was invited by a group of computer science and ecology researchers that were based mostly in Germany and Poland and the US to collaborate on a project to study biodiversity factors in urban areas as well. So this is quite an interesting collaboration that was led mostly by the computer scientists. So I had not been in a situation like this before either. For the research, we basically created a series of smart planters, which are basically these planters that are outfitted with some documenting and sensing technologies. We worked with a number of partners to install and maintain these planters. Part of the idea is that this planter is also didactic. So when you each of the planters has a QR code. When you scan it, you can read more about biodiversity loss around the world and see these kind of bar graphs that depict some data. Also, in Buffalo, so there were a number of these planters developed for different countries, but in Buffalo we had picked 4 sites that were all basically different patches, from a kind of small fragmented patch in the middle of the city to a kind of larger area on the periphery. And we kind of installed them in these 4 sites, and each of the planters, in a way, almost a control group. We planted the same exact plants in the planter, arranged in the same exact way, and the planters each faced north. They always they all face north in the same direction. So the idea was to see, to document some of the insects that were flying around there. If you have the same plants, like if the area around it was different, what would you get? And so here's some of the plants or the planters. We also, within each of the planters, there's also these boxes for solitary bees. So I don't know if you can see this really well, but on the right side, you can see our kind of documenting of solitary bee occupation over time. They're basically sort of wooden blocks where holes are drilled in of a certain length and width. And there were a lot of people in this project that were involved not just in creating the structures, but also in maintaining them and the plants and documenting them. But I want to switch, and so before I was talking about architecture as a form of environmental activism and kind of environmental advocacy, and then kind of working with interdisciplinary collaborations. But another model that I've been very keen on kind of developing, especially as an academic, as a professor in the school, is a collaborative model with the School of Architecture, where I take on, as a designer, I take on the role both as a designer and an educator. And so last year, I was actually awarded a fellowship by Pratt School of Architecture, by their inaugural MLA program, to basically take on a project at a place called Pjall Catskill, which is a landscape hotel in the Catskills. And it was a kind of nebulous kind of charge. Basically, it was like, well, you designed something, but you involved these MLA students. You figure out a way to involve our inaugural class of MLA students in their first year. So the idea that I developed was basically that I would develop an armature and basically work with the students to kind of create a number of kind of insect, bird, and bat habitats that could then serve as kind of adornments or ways to kind of round out this project. And so the process was essentially, me conducting online workshops with the Pratt students and giving them sort of guidelines for creating habitats. I think they'd used this also as a shop training exercise, because they were MLA students and they hadn't used the shop in their first year. So they were basically, working in the shop to make these things. And then together we came together at Pjall and worked to basically, I came with the armatures and they came with the habitat boxes, and we worked together to arrange them on the armatures to create these structures. So these were some of the kind of finished. These are the finished structures there, and here's some photos of us. Also, the maintenance people, they were key in helping us out on the right side. But I think another project that within this mode of collaboration between my practice and institution of higher learning, one of my most favorite experiences, of course, with my own institution, University of Buffalo. This is for a project called To Middle Species with Love, which I developed for Exhibit Columbus, which is a biennial design exhibition in Columbus, Indiana. And so in 2021, I was one of 7 University Design Research Fellows for this. The theme was called New Middles from Main Street to Megalopolis, and it was developed by Mimi Zeiger and Iker Hill, who were the exhibition's curators. We were interested in thinking about the a middle species, you know. So when one thinks about animals, you know, if you ask someone about like what's your favorite animal, oftentimes people will talk about flagship species, right? So the species that are charismatic, that invite you know, contributions to conservation, that, you know, that really kind of pull at heartstrings, right? Those are charismatic species. But what about the species that are not noticed? And so what about these species that are our neighbors and they're around us, but we don't typically acknowledge them? So I was interested in kind of thinking about species through this lens. And so in Indiana, Columbus, Indiana, I basically went to kind of explore the city and walked around with a bat detector. Here, that's me during the pandemic with my bat detecting equipment, walking around, and looking at this idea of what I was thinking about at the time as species strata. So what are the animals that exist in the air, that live in the air, occupy the air versus the ground? So what in this project we were looking at bat and bird habitat above, and also in these kind of rock. I was thinking about ideas of like stacking rocks for and stones for terrestrial species like reptiles and amphibians. So the site that I was eventually given was Millrace Park, which is a project by Michael van Valkenburg, and the proposal was essentially a series of 9 of these kind of habitat towers that would be kind of arrayed adjacent to this observation tower that's by Stanley Sadowitz. The idea of this was also, you know, that these towers would sort of be almost like characters that would sort of lean into each other, kind of almost like evoking the idea of like maybe having a conversation. There were also places for people to sit. The project was located at the confluence of 2 rivers, so it was actually flooded quite often. This is an area that was flooded quite often, so the rock mounds were very important for, you know, for amphibious animals. And here's we aligned the kind of array of towers with some of the trees, and here's us stacking rocks again. They're all dry stacked rocks, stones, local stones at the base. And one of the things that was really interesting as well about this is even during the process of installing this project, these little toads started to try to hop in. We noticed toads actually coming toward the project and trying to kind of enter this dry stack stone. And at some point, we noticed that we had created the base a little high, because every time the toads tried to hop in, they would smack themselves in the steel and fall down. So we had to actually adjust the base a little bit so that to make almost like toad steps, so that they could hop in a little bit better. So here's the project as it is built. You can see people sitting on it, and here's the view at night. One of the fun aspects of this project also is that I was able to collaborate with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, with a mammologist there who loaned us some bat detection equipment. Not sure if you've ever heard bats. You typically can't hear them with your own ear because they speak at a frequency much higher than we do, but they sound like this. And so with these recorded bat sounds, I also collaborated with 2 musicians who took the bat sounds and made bat music. So this is basically taking the bat sounds and resampling them and making this music. All right, so so I'll show you a kind of 6-minute video. So this is now just to kind of give you a sense of the sort of, because I was talking about collaborative processes. As a University Design Research Fellow, they actually asked me to make a video that kind of talked about the experience of working on this with the university as well. So I'm going to just show this quickly. This is all bat music in the background, in case you're wondering.
One of the aspects of being part of Exhibit Columbus was bringing together our community at the UB School of Architecture and Planning to learn about the incredible legacy of architecture and landscape in Columbus. In the early phases of the project, I engaged a number of student groups to work with me in exploring and researching the city. Early participants were students from AIAS, American Institute of Architecture students, UB NOMAS, National Organization of Minority Architecture Students, and AASAP, African American Students of Architecture and Planning. These students worked with me back and forth between Zoom and in-person model building to develop and visualize the first design design ideas. My graduate assistant, Nicole Sarmiento, played an enormous role in really developing the design of the project throughout the spring semester. Mark Bajorek, our structural engineer and my longtime collaborator in Buffalo, was a critical part of our team as well. In tandem with the design process, I conducted a graduate studio that looked at Columbus and asked students to research the city and develop speculative proposals to amplify habitat for middle species in the region. As a compendium course, my colleague Prairie taught a seminar that explored the landscapes of Columbus through research and drawing. At the UB School of Architecture and Planning, a culture of making is emphasized in the kinds of projects that we do, and also in the way that we dedicate our attention and resources. For Exhibit Columbus, I was keen to explore the culture of materials, not only in terms of their performance, but also in terms of life cycle and sourcing. So early visits to material suppliers, such as Estes and Hope, Indiana, as well as looking at the Indiana hardwood industry, influenced the material ecology of the project. Of fabrication, I was also very interested in highlighting the community of makers in Buffalo. Our materials and methods shop is fantastic, and it's one of the most used and beloved spaces on campus. It's not only an incredible resource for design studios, but also for seminars and even some large lecture courses, such as structures. Our shop manager, Wade Georgie, is really the secret ingredient to making design-build projects happen. For our project, he not only coached us all in welding, which was pretty much new to everyone on the team, but he also fabricated critical components, and in the face of some of the supply chain issues that impacted our schedule, Wade also helped us secure a good part of the lumber that we needed to construct our project, and even donated some decade-old salvaged steel from a past design-build project at the school. In addition to 3 members of our original team, a number of additional students and alumni pitched in to help us fabricate the project throughout the summer. The installation process in Columbus was supported and really made possible by the local community. We were amazed by the level of care and attention that Vince Rubio and his team from the Department of Public Works put into all of the installations. And we are very grateful to Tim Coomer and his team from the Millrace Parks maintenance crew for all their help. And personally, I was thrilled to learn how to operate a blue lift thanks to the staff at Ogles Rentals. Additionally, we were energized by the enthusiasm of all of the volunteers from Columbus who helped out, including the Environmental Club of Columbus North High School. But it was really our dedicated crew of 3 UB students, Nicole Sarmiento, Bethany Greenaway, and Shavin Doe, who were at the heart of the installation process. I can't say enough about how hard this group has worked, not only during the hot days on site, but all throughout the summer. Additionally, we are so grateful to colleagues and friends who made an effort to join us for a little time in Columbus to lend a hand. Greg Delaney, Albert Chow, Lisa Ramsberg, and John Pitkin. I think one of the most exciting things that has surfaced from this project has been the expanded network of collaborators that we started working with. Early discussions with ecologists, and especially with Tim Shires from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, steered the direction of the project toward an ambition to conduct research on bat populations in a more engaged and dynamic way. Through Tim, the Indiana DNR is loaning us a number of ultrasonic bat detectors and recorders, which are continuously collecting bat calls that will add to the DNR's database. Additionally, we formed an exciting new collaboration with 2 sound artists, Sean Chuki and Pinocchio, or Zach Williams, who are taking the bat calls as source material for producing soundtracks by digitally processing and mixing the sounds, which is what we are listening to here.
Okay. So along the lines of bat music, so I hope you enjoyed so all of that was music made by these musicians taking bat sounds. Along the lines of the kind of like appeal of bat music, I became interested more recently in how architecture can bring and associated effects can bring humans closer to understanding and maybe even empathizing with non-human neighbors. So I'll show a couple of projects quickly to kind of give you a sense of this. This is a project that I did with Nerea Feliz, an architect at UT Austin. Together we work as Double Happiness. And we did a project in Matadero that was interested in, Matadero Madrid, which is a former slaughterhouse in Madrid that's now an arts organization. And we were really interested in amplifying the presence of insects and plants and kind of making green space in this kind of like hot urban plaza by Matadero. And so the project essentially was to, on the one hand, we were really interested in the vision and perception of insects and how we can bring this experience to humans. So these are some drawings that we did kind of looking at the world through the lens of insects or from the point of view of the insects. And the project is essentially a series of pavilion-like structures. They're kind of like urban furnishings. These are models that we developed showing some of the prototypes that we had developed. They're basically like a set of urban furnishings that, that serve as like planters, seating, pollinator gardens. You can see this one as a caterpillar refuge. This one we had called arthropod cinema, which is this idea of like projecting light and kind of showing the kind of shadows of moths that might be flocking to something like light projecting at night. This one was something that we called human cocoon. It's a kind of intimate space in where you could potentially sit together and look out these kind of lenses to see the world as if you're an insect. We're really interested in this idea of insect vision, and so creating drawings even that tried to kind of try to understand obviously we can't really know this completely, but to try to look at the world as if you were an insect. And along those lines, we worked with a filmmaker to create a film for the exhibition that was called Butterfly Vision. This is one that, understanding that butterflies, insects, birds see only certain colors, see ultraviolet reflective light, and they don't see other colors. We were really interested in, trying to create something where you could, an experience where you could almost like fly over a field of flowers as if you were a butterfly. So this is what this is trying to show. And also together with Nerea, we, just last year, our most recent project, we developed a project called Multi-Species Lounge, and this is a commission from the Bentway in Toronto to develop a public installation that would bring attention to the ecologies around the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto. And so again, in this project, we were really interested in this idea of bird and insect perception and how we could start to kind of get at that through design, a kind of design experience. So essentially the project is a kind of an array of public seating in a public plaza. At top are a number of bird houses and insect boxes at the mid-level, and also kind of gabion cages filled with concrete rubble from a nearby demolition site or construction site. And it's really a kind of public place. So it was actually quite popular. It's in the middle of Toronto. There were a lot of people sitting at it and kind of playing their kids, like hopping all over it. But also, in addition to being a kind of public, furniture in public setting, we were really interested, again, as I mentioned, in this idea of like bird and insect vision. So these habitat boxes are basically painted with a pattern where if you see them in daylight, they look one way, but if you put black light or UV reflective or UV light on them, you can see this kind of other pattern emerge, right? And simultaneously, we actually had a web-based component as well that was called Lounge Voices. And here we were kind of thinking about thinking about the species around the areas and what they might be saying. So like through the first person perspective of the animals, what you might hear. So this is the groundhog.
My ancestors are from North America. We are a family of builders and take pride in the way that we create our burrows underground. We've honed some clever methods of construction over the generations. For example, we dig our in-ground entrances in a way that protects our homes from flooding. In creating any new tunnel, the first step is to dig for a few feet down, then dig uphill for a few feet, and then continue to tunnel for a longer stretch. Because this technique works so well in controlling water from flooding our burrows, we also build latrines in this way too.
Okay, so that groundhog actually lived in the patio underneath where the site was. So we were interested in highlighting some of these species, these all live as a kind of videos on the web. But at the site, you could sort of at the project, you could scan in a QR code, and we were imagining that if there were a bunch of people scanning in QR codes, you could hear different stories. So you might experience something like this.
I'm a swallow. You could say that my family is quite cosmopolitan. My relatives live all over the world. My ancestors lived in cliffs and caves.
You can find my family in southern Canada and in the United States and Mexico. We're small, but we're easy to find because of our bright metallic green.
My family is from southern Ontario and present eastern.
All right, so moving on. So I'll conclude now by just talking about, again, the importance of multi-species design, which I've been an advocate of for a very long time, for almost 20 years. Of course, you're familiar, you know that thinking about multi-species design is a way of enhancing biodiversity and ecosystem services and advocating for the environment through the arts and working through interdisciplinary and interinstitutional collaborations and generally raising awareness, right? So this is something that I think we as designers are becoming more, at least in architecture, I don't think architecture as a discipline has been as aware or interested in these issues, but I think they're coming more to the fore now. But a question I have is like, why do we as humans still do stuff like this, right? This is some community came together and thought that this was a good idea, to put bird spikes on a tree. And so I think in our current culture, at least as architects, in the culture that we have in building, we're far more used to kind of keeping animals away from buildings. So building buildings in a way where animals get in, and then we try to get them out, and then we exclude buildings or exclude animals through things like this, like patching them up and repairing things. And instead, I'd like for everyone to kind of think about architecture instead as how we might design with our neighbors in mind. And for example, this is a project that I did recently as well called For Our Neighbors. We imagined the idea of a roof structure that could be amplified to house different birds. This is for an exhibition at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and also a shout out to DMU. So Paul is here, who's in that photo as well. So DMU, which I'm a part of, went, also a model of collaborative working, and in my view, went to visit this project as well. And I think the idea of designing for and with animals and birds is not something that's entirely new. We've seen a lot of projects in the past, such as these birdhouses from the Ottoman Empire, these pigeon houses or the pigeon towers from Iran in the 16th, 17th century. These are not new, right? These have been around for a long time. So why are we designing against animals anyway? This is something I ask architects all the time when they're already outsmarting us. You might have seen this recently, but this is a researcher from the Netherlands who recently discovered and documented birds that were making nests out of these bird prevention spikes. So if they're already outsmarting us, why are we trying to keep them off our buildings anyway, right? And we're at a moment now when animals such as dolphins, whales, chimpanzees, elephants, and others are being recognized as non-human persons. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this. There's also bodies of water, such as rivers, that are being given personhood status with the rights that entails. Even a robot named Sophia, which is obviously non-human, has been given citizenship to Saudi Arabia. So what does that mean? So in the global context of recognizing non-humans as persons, what does this mean for us as architects and designers? And how can we think about the environment in a much more radically inclusive way? And that's the question I will leave you with today. Thank you. Sorry, excuse me.
Thank you very much, Joyce. We have time for a couple of questions before we take a break. So, wow, this is great. Everyone has their hand up already. I'll bring the mic to you, and then I'll hang out and take it from you and take it to the next break.
Hi, I'm Shreya.
Hello.
One of the things that I think as landscape architects we've been trying to grapple with is the relationship between humans and non-humans. And I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of times that interaction tends to be volatile.
Volatile, did you say? Yeah.
If I imagine if I was in the bug exhibition, I would be swatting a few.
Right.
So I feel like when you're designing these structures, keeping in mind that there's a multi-species interaction going to take place, like how do you solve that problem of things not being harmonious? Like, do you try to control that interaction? Do you expect people to come into the space with that understanding that you're coexisting with a different species? Like, how do you navigate that problem?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think about that a lot. Oftentimes, if I'm talking with students or people who are looking for advice on designing their house, for example, and let's say they want to put up a bat house or something, I'll say like, well, yes, I mean, in a way, it's almost like common sense, but in a way, you have to kind of choreograph where things go, right? You don't put a bat house up where you're also going to put an outdoor picnic table because you know that bats are going to poop. You know animals poop, so like if that's going to happen, obviously, I can't think of an animal that doesn't poop. Then you need to kind of create, like a garden or something in a place where it's not going to be a problem. So there's a kind of choreographing between areas of where, that are more suitable for certain species and then areas where humans might go. So that's a way that I tend to think about it. Of course, you can't keep species, I mean, they will occupy places that obviously where they're not where you don't want them to be, and sometimes a lot of it is just trying to live with insects. Like you've probably, and something I tell architects a lot is that in the average home there are over 100 species, and that's just something that you just have to live with. Mm-hmm. Right, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't know if, in terms of the budget question, yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking, I don't know if I have a real answer to the budget question. I think but in terms of, so this was a proposal, a kind of speculative proposal that I did for Buffalo. At the time, Buffalo was actually changing its zoning code, so I was hoping that somehow by doing a research project, I could somehow influence the way the code might shape. And I don't know if it necessarily did. I actually don't think anybody at City Hall was really listening to me at the time. But there were other academics that were sort of saying like, there should be a way to write into policy, that spaces, if they're left a certain way, need to kind of like have a certain amount of green space, or there should be a way that gets written into the code or something. But I don't think that's necessarily happened. But I do think if there's an awareness that you have a piece of land, if there's awareness to like landowners or to property owners, if you have a piece of land where there's a buffer space, like what could you do with it that could connect it with other, green spaces in the city? That could be, it's a kind of advocacy maybe at a kind of individual level, but also trying to kind of change code. And in terms of budget, I think one of the things I had thought about, I didn't show this in the slide set, but one of the other kind of restrictions that we had was that there were certain properties where if you had a certain use, you actually had to build a 6-foot-high wall around your property. There's some industrial uses. And I was at the time trying to advocate for people to think about green walls and making those walls suitable for species instead of just kind of making these blank, cinder block walls and stuff. So again, it's like, yeah, kind of education and advocacy, yeah.
Thank you. I love hearing about your projects, and so many of them are so joyful and delightful. I was wondering, have you run into any resistance with different regulatory frameworks? You kind of referenced some of the zoning codes and obviously the building codes that apply to your line of work. I was curious if you've had resistance through that, and if you've been able to kind of dialogue and resolve those issues, or maybe it hasn't been too much of a
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I was actually just telling Charlie earlier, I wouldn't say, maybe not regulatory. So in Buffalo, there was a period of time actually in the early when I first moved there, when beekeeping was not allowed, but then that changed, and then now you can have a certain number of hives. But I think the pressure has not been so much regulatory, because my projects are so small and kind of interventions. They're basically seen as like art projects essentially. So they're like there's some cases where I've actually had to get permits, but they're much more architectural and less to do with the species. It's more like, how is this going to stand up over time? It's more like those kinds of questions. But I've gotten a lot more resistance in the early days from people in the community that thought that building structures for animals was a bad idea. You know, so like when I was trying to install a bat tower, I actually got the funding first. I got a grant to build a project, and I was like, sweet, I have money. I'm gonna build this somewhere. Someone's gonna want this. But no, everybody was like, no, I love the idea, but we cannot put a structure for bats. We're gonna get a lot of like criticism and so on, even the environmental groups in the city. And so that was back in 2009 when I was going around trying to find a site for this project, and eventually a sculpture park thought it would be a good idea. So, and there's been a number of situations like that where there's resistance from the community, but that's changed now that I feel like the conversation is different now. Now, like for example, the Toronto project is like, they wanted us to build a multi-species habitat right in the middle of a busy, public square. So great. So happy about that.
Hello, my name is Calvin. I'm in the architecture department here and the landscape program.
Great.
And something I really appreciate about your work is that you're also trying to find ways to empathize with other species and how they perceive the environment. So it's not just a formal exercise, but there are like some I find very pleasing formal and aesthetic aspects of the work.
Well, thank you.
And so, yeah, like the middle species with love towers kind of remind me of like tiny leafless woods.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting. Okay.
But I'm wondering in your process of design how that comes into play. Merging aesthetics that are pleasing to us, maybe as designers or as to people, and then also things that might be perceivable to other species, and whether that's kind of this strategic line of design.
Yes.
To get it kind of to get it going.
Yeah, that's an astute observation. Absolutely. I actually think, when I speak with ecologists, sometimes they'll say things like, the best thing you can do for species is just throw a rotting log into the backyard. A rotting log is the best thing. But the issue I have is like, yes, okay, we can put a rotting log there, but who really wants to look at a rotting log? It's like, that's not accepted by people. Like, people do not want to have rotting logs in their backyard. And so the question that I have is like, how do you make rotting logs beautiful? Or how do you create conditions that are similar, that are in a way like work almost the way that charisma works for species? Like, this is the thing that always drives me crazy, is that if an animal's cute, then people want to conserve it. But if it's not, then of course I'm like dumbing this down a little bit, but it's like, but how do you kind of use design and kind of creating something that is compelling to kind of advocate for inhabitants, I guess. Maybe if that's so I do think about spatial formal issues a lot, and I could probably give another whole lecture about that if we wanted, but we're not going to do that. But happy to talk more about that later too. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about form. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
I'm Harissa. I really love your work. I've noticed that you have a very wide variety of projects and species that you're working with, and I'm interested in kind of what your research process is and understanding their behaviors, and have their behaviors been truly predictable?
Right.
And by they, I mean the wildlife that you're
Right.
working with.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's pretty varied. I mean, in the earlier days, I did a lot of reaching out to biologists and ecologists, and I still do that now. With every project, I always speak with biologists and ecologists that have expertise in specific species, that where they're actually going out into the, into caves or into other places and observing them. In early projects, I went on walks with Katerina, the biologist, and she was like mist netting bats and stuff, and talking, and just by kind of hanging out with them and observing them, that was sort of one way. But of course, it's like I also did a lot of like research reading articles, and also trying to, even like really basic things too, like stuff that you can find online, like there's a lot of stuff now about how to build bat houses, and certain types of bat houses that have worked for certain species. Like for example, in the To Middle Species with Love, we used the rocket box bat house, which is a typology of like telescoping. It's like a series of boxes that are kind of telescoping from one another, and that's been proven to be good for Indiana bats. But so it's a combination of things, I would say. And now with most of the projects I'm doing, for example, I'm doing another project now with Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, and they've actually hired ecologists and scientists from the American Museum of Natural History that are going to be doing research on species and stuff like that. So now there's like more and more people that are kind of part of the process.
Hi, Joyce. I'm Solomon, and I think you're really a good designer and educator. And I think we spend like a lot of time to prove the necessity to do something, but finally we just propose something. So I really admire your attitude to spiritualize it, to actualize it, to design. And I have a more practical question to you. I actually share birds in my bedroom.
Wait, did you say you share birds?
Sorry, I share my bedroom with birds.
Oh, okay.
Because there's like AC, part of the AC is in my bedroom, part of it is also
Oh,
my bedroom. And this by the design, because the structure is like layered in the AC as well. So
yeah.
currently I'm using my curtain to split my room with their nest.
Oh my goodness. Oh wow.
Every morning I can hear their singing, and I have a very happy mood. And my question is, I don't usually use the AC, but maybe in winter I will use that. Will that break our relationship? What can I do to improve our living environment?
Wait, what can you do to improve what?
My living environment with the birds.
Well, okay, let me try to understand. So the birds are like, they're nesting, and there's some kind of hole or something in your bedroom and you've separated it with a curtain.
Yeah.
And the birds are on the other side of the curtain.
Yeah.
And so in the winter, you want to continue living with the birds inside, or? I don't know. No, I mean, it's so interesting.
They are very happy playing
Right. I mean, I don't see any problem with that necessarily. I mean, you obviously want to insulate your bedroom so that you're not losing too much heat in the winter. You don't want to. So, but I think it's fine to, like, there's actually a lot. I don't know what you can do specifically with your bedroom. If you want to show me photos, I can take a look. But oftentimes architects will use like basically like metal mesh. Like that's a way to kind of like exclude. I guess I'm wondering like how. Anyway, we could talk about this later, but oftentimes architects use metal mesh to exclude animals. So if you want them to kind of be nearby, but not to fly like right into your space, metal mesh is a good way to kind of like keep animals out, but also kind of, so that's one way. But I don't know, I have to look at photos of your bedroom to actually get a better understanding of that.
Okay, we're going to let Catherine have the final question, and then we'll have 30 minutes or so, or 45 minutes. We can all meet downstairs, and we'll open Joyce up to all of you, and show pictures of the animal problems you have.
I'm going to remember that. Like, okay.
My question is about, everyone is asking everyone this question. How is AI going to inform your work? And I think specifically, how will you help erosion bird? I don't know if you all know erosion bird, but
No, what's erosion bird?
I thought everyone knew that.
I don't know what erosion bird.
TikTok watchers.
Oh.
Erosion bird is everywhere, and I think it kind of speaks to a kind of relationship between humans and animals.
Oh my gosh, I need to watch this.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry I don't know about this, but.
Curious, like you showed a little bit on sensors and AI, and I was just curious how you think your work with, maybe robotics and animals can start to transform the way you're thinking about those relationships.
Wow, that's a really good question. I have to say I haven't thought about it in terms of sensors and robotics yet. I mean, something that I've been sort of tinkering with really, I mean, and just like in general, like really interested in is like how we can start to produce narratives through ChatGPT and AI to kind of, to kind of pull, like, so a lot of the lounge voice, the stories, for example, that I was writing was just like me writing, doing research and writing as if I were a bird or, raccoon or like, or insect. But I think there's a way to kind of like think of AI as like a collaborator in the process and co-authoring in the way that one might co-author with animals. I don't know, that's sort of like one thread that I have, but I would be really interested in hearing others because it is something that I'm interested in thinking about especially with our faculty at UB too, but yeah.
All right, y'all. Thank you all so much. Maybe congratulations.
Thank you.